The child had not opened her eyes for 23 days. Ilara stood in the pristine hallway of the Han estate, her worn black suitcase resting beside shoes with soles nearly worn through, listening as the man before her described how his daughter was vanishing. Not all at once, but slowly, like watching smoke dissolve into air, watching something that once glowed with life turn cold and still. "The specialists have given up," Han Jaemin said. His black suit sat perfectly across his broad shoulders, but his dark eyes, once sharp as broken glass, were now hollow caverns, empty spaces where hope had been buried alive. They attempted everything. For drips, experimental treatments, the finest child psychologists in Seoul. She remained motionless, her small chest barely rising and falling, staring through the ceiling as though she were already somewhere else, somewhere her mother could find her. Ilara kept her bandaged hands steady at her sides. She wore the only presentable dress she owned, the one she had carefully pressed for job interviews over the past 2 years. She had come here to apply for a housekeeping position. The agency had mentioned the family needed a cleaner who could work around a sick child with discretion. They had not mentioned they needed someone who could bring a dying girl back from the edge of nothingness. And they certainly had not mentioned the man hiring her was the most feared syndicate boss in all of Seoul. "I need you to understand something, miss." Jaemin paused, realizing he didn't even know her name. "Ilara," she said quietly. "Miss Ilara." His voice, the voice accustomed to commanding entire criminal networks, fractured slightly when he spoke of his daughter. "My wife died 4 months ago. Her car went off a bridge in the mountains. Yuna was supposed to be with her grandmother that day, but she begged to go with her mother instead." He stopped, his jaw clenching as if trying to crush something painful between his teeth. "She survived with barely a scratch. But something inside her died with her mother in those cold waters." The antique clock mounted on the wall marked each passing second. Every tick felt like another piece of the child slipping away into darkness. "Yuna stopped speaking 2 weeks after the funeral," Jaemin continued, his tone mechanical, as though reading from a report. "Stopped eating 5 weeks after that. We brought in doctors from Tokyo, from Johns Hopkins, from the best private hospitals in Switzerland. Child psychiatrists, grief counselors, specialists in pediatric trauma. Nothing made a difference. She just lies there in her pink pajamas, fading a little more before my eyes every single day." He exhaled slowly. "The last caregiver we hired quit 3 days ago. She said watching a 6-year-old choose death over life was destroying her own will to live." I understood. "Most people cannot bear to witness it." His gaze locked onto Ilara's. "But the agency mentioned you worked as a medical assistant before you came to domestic work. Is this accurate?" "Yes, sir," Ilara answered, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I left that field due to certain circumstances beyond my control." "I don't care about your circumstances." Jaemin's directness wasn't unkind, merely honest, the way a drowning man speaks when he has no breath left for politeness. "I only care whether you can reach my daughter when no one else has been able to." He moved to the tall window overlooking the manicured gardens below. "This position pays triple the standard rate for household staff. If you can get Yuna to eat even 1 spoonful of food, I will give you a bonus of 50 million won. If you can get her to speak again, another 50 million. He turned back, and Ilara saw something she never expected to see in the eyes of a man who had made the Seoul underworld bow before him, the raw desperation of a father watching his child disappear. "I know it sounds like I'm attempting to purchase a miracle," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. "But I would burn my entire empire to ashes if it would bring her back. Miss Ilara, I have done unspeakable things in my life. I have broken men, destroyed families, built my power on violence and fear." He paused, and for a moment looked utterly defeated. "But losing my daughter, that is something my soul cannot survive." Ilara looked past Jaemin, through the floor-to-ceiling windows that led deeper into the mansion. Somewhere inside this estate filled with armed guards and expensive silence, a 6-year-old girl was dying by inches, not from disease, but from a heart that could not find a reason to keep beating without her mother. "I'll accept the position," Alara said, her voice clear and certain. "And I'm grateful for your offer. But I need you to promise me one thing, Mr. Han." Jaemin's eyebrow lifted slightly, as if it had been years since anyone had dared to negotiate terms with him. "What?" "Whatever I decide to do for Yuna, even if it seems improper or goes against every rule in this house, you will allow it. No interference, no questions, no instructing your security to stop me." She held his gaze. "Can you give me that promise?" A heavy silence filled the space between them. Han Jae-min, the man who had not taken orders from anyone since inheriting his father's criminal organization at 23, studied the young woman standing before him. The battered suitcase, the worn shoes, the bandaged hands that spoke of hard labor, but those warm brown eyes did not waver or look away. For the first time in 4 months, something stirred in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the faint echo of what hope had once felt like. "I promise," he said. Have you ever watched someone you love slip away, powerless to save them? Unable to find the words or the touch that could pull them back from the darkness? If this story gripped your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to experience this journey. And here's what I really need you to do. Subscribe to this channel right now. Don't just watch and leave. Click that subscribe button because what happens next between Alara and this broken family will shake you to your core, and you don't want to miss a single moment. This is only the beginning of Alara's dangerous journey into a world where love and loyalty might cost her everything. Subscribe so you're here when the next chapter drops. Trust me, you'll regret it if you miss what's coming next. The water in the bucket turned pink from Alara's bleeding knuckles before she even finished scrubbing the first hallway. The marble floors of the Han estate stretched endlessly in every direction, gleaming white and cold as a morgue. She had been on her hands and knees since 4 in the morning, and the chemical smell of industrial cleaner had long since burned away the inside of her nostrils. This was what 50-hour weeks bought in Seoul when you had no papers, no connections, and skin too dark for the employment agencies to look you in the eye. She rewrapped the thin bandages around her fingers, watching the fabric immediately soak through with a fresh bloom of red, and kept scrubbing. The silence in this house was not peaceful. It was the silence of a mausoleum, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the tick of expensive clocks and the distant murmur of guards speaking in low tones. Alara had cleaned homes before, apartments filled with laughter and crying babies and the smell of dinner cooking. This place had none of that warmth. Every surface was spotless, every corner shadowed, every room carefully controlled. She knew what Han Jae-min was before she ever met him face to face. The other cleaners whispered about him in the service quarters, voices dropping to frightened murmurs. They said he had earned his position by making 3 rival bosses disappear in a single night. They said politicians bowed to him, that judges took his phone calls, that even the Seoul police looked the other way when his black cars rolled through the streets. They said he was ice-wrapped in expensive suits, a man who felt nothing and destroyed anyone who crossed him. But when Alara passed the master suite that first morning, cloth in her raw hands, she saw something the whispers had not mentioned. Through the half-open door, she glimpsed Han Jae-min sitting motionless beside a small bed. His perfect suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened as though he had been sitting there all night. He held his daughter's limp hand between both of his own, his head bowed, shoulders curved inward like a man who had taken a fatal wound but refused to fall. The feared syndicate boss, the man who controlled half of Seoul's criminal empire, sat in that shadowed room looking utterly powerless. Alara's hands tightened around the cleaning cloth. She had seen that posture before, in hospital rooms and grief counseling sessions during her years as a medical assistant. It was the posture of someone watching death approach and finding themselves completely, devastatingly helpless to stop it. She moved past the doorway without making a sound, her heart suddenly aching for a man she had every reason to fear, and returned to scrubbing floors that would never be clean enough to erase the grief soaked into every corner of this silent, frozen house. Elara was not supposed to be on the third floor at 2 in the morning. The guards had made that abundantly clear. But she had heard it again, that sound that had been haunting her dreams for the past 3 nights. Not crying, something worse. The thin, rattling breath of a child whose body was forgetting how to live. She climbed the stairs with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, her bandaged hands trembling slightly. The door to the master suite stood open just a crack, and dim lamplight spilled into the hallway. Inside, Han Jae-min had finally surrendered to exhaustion, his head tilted back against the chair, one hand still reaching toward the bed even in sleep. His face looked older in the shadows, carved with lines that had not been there in the photographs she had seen around the house. Elara slipped inside like a ghost. The child on the bed was so small, so terribly still. Yuna's pink pajamas hung loose on her shrinking frame, her skin pale as paper, her breathing so shallow it barely moved the blankets. Dark circles ringed her closed eyes. She looked like a porcelain doll someone had forgotten to finish painting. Without thinking, without planning, Elara knelt beside the bed and dipped the cloth into the warm water. She began gently wiping Yuna's face, careful strokes along her forehead, her cheeks, her small chin. The child's skin was cool to the touch, as though the warmth was already draining from her. "I know you're tired, little one," Elara whispered in English, her native tongue, knowing the child could not understand, but needing to speak anyway. "I know you miss her. I know it hurts to breathe." And then, without meaning to, she began to hum. It was a melody her own grandmother had sung to her during the hardest nights of her childhood, when hunger gnawed at her belly and fear kept her awake. A low, soulful tune that spoke of endurance, of surviving when surviving seemed impossible, of love that reached across darkness to find you. Yuna's eyelid twitched. Elara froze, her humming catching in her throat. She watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the child's fingers curled slightly against the sheets. The monitors beside the bed showed the faintest change in heart rate, a small spike upward after weeks of flat, dying rhythm. "What are you doing?" The voice cut through the room like a blade. Elara's head snapped up to find Han Jae-min on his feet, his eyes blazing with a fury that turned her blood cold. In 2 strides he was beside her, his hand gripping her wrist hard enough to bruise. "I told you to clean, not to touch." He stopped. His gaze dropped to the bed, and the anger drained from his face like water through a broken dam. Yuna's eyes were fluttering. Her lips parted, drawing in a deeper breath than she had taken in 23 days. And her small hand, the one Elara had been cleaning, slowly, impossibly, lifted from the mattress and reached toward the sound of that humming, toward the warmth of that touch. Jaemin released Elara's wrist and sank to his knees beside the bed, his voice breaking into fragments. "Yuna? Yuna, baby, can you hear me?" Elara resumed humming, softer now, and the child's eyes cracked open just a sliver, searching blindly for the source of the melody that had called her back from wherever she had been hiding. The doctors returned at dawn, a parade of white coats and tight lips, wheeling in another 4-stand, another bag of clear liquid nutrition that would drip into Yuna's veins while her stomach continued to forget its purpose. They spoke in rapid Korean, gesturing at charts and monitors, and Elara understood none of their words, but all of their meaning. They were preparing to keep a dying child alive on machines. "No." Elara's voice was quiet, but absolute. Every head in the room turned toward her. Han Jae-min stood by the window, his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not read. He had not spoken to her since the moment Yuna's eyes had opened, since his daughter had reached toward this foreign woman instead of him. "Take the 4 equipment away," Elara continued, her hands clasped in front of her stained apron. "If you want me to try, I need you to let me do this my way." One of the doctors began to protest, his face reddening, but Jamin raised a single hand and the room fell silent. "Everyone out," he said. "Leave us." When the door closed behind them, he turned to Alara. "You have 72 hours. If she deteriorates, the medical team returns. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Then show me what you believe will save my daughter." Alara went to the kitchen, ignoring the startled looks from the household staff, and began pulling ingredients from the immaculate shelves. Rice, chicken broth, ginger, a touch of garlic, a pinch of salt. She worked quickly, her bandaged hands moving with practiced ease, building a simple juk, the Korean porridge she had learned to make during her first months in Seoul. But she added something else, a handful of spices from a small pouch she kept in her apron pocket, flavors from her own childhood that spoke of warmth and home and survival. When she returned to Yuna's room with a bowl of steaming broth, Jamin was sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, stroking her hair with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man who commanded such violence. Alara sat on the opposite side and lifted a small spoon. "Yuna," she said softly, "I'm going to tell you a story about a little girl who didn't want to eat either." The child's eyes remained closed, but her breathing shifted slightly, as though she were listening. This little girl lost everything. Her home burned down, her family scattered like dust in the wind, and she found herself in a place where no one looked like her, where no one spoke her language, where every day felt like drowning. Alara dipped the spoon into the broth, watching steam curl upward. She was so tired, Yuna. So tired that eating seemed pointless. Why eat when tomorrow would only bring more pain? She brought the spoon closer to Yuna's lips. But then someone told her something important. They said that surviving, even when it hurts, even when you don't want to, is the bravest thing a person can do. That every breath you take is a way of saying you're still here, still fighting, still honoring the people who loved you. Yuna's eyelids fluttered open. Those dark eyes, so much like her father's, focused slowly on Alara's face. "Your mother would want you to live, sweetheart. Not because dying is wrong, but because living is how we keep loving them." Alara touched the spoon to Yuna's lips. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, so slowly it seemed to take forever, the child's mouth opened, and she took the first sip of food she had accepted in 26 days. Across the bed, Han Jamin closed his eyes, and a single tear traced down his face before he could stop it. "Alara." The word was barely a whisper, thin as spider silk, but it shattered the silence of the room like thunder. Yuna had spoken for the first time in 4 months, and the name she chose was not her father's. Alara nearly dropped the hairbrush she had been using to gently work through the tangles in Yuna's hair. It had been 5 days since that first sip of broth, 5 days of small victories. Yesterday, Yuna had eaten 3 spoonfuls. This morning, she had sat up on her own, propped against the pillows, watching Alara move around the room with dark, curious eyes. But speaking was something the specialists had said might never return. "Yes, sweetheart." Alara managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." "It hurts," Yuna whispered, touching her own scalp where the brush had caught on a particularly stubborn knot. "I'm sorry, baby. I'll be gentler, I promise." Alara adjusted her grip on the brush, but the movement made her wince, a sharp intake of breath she could not quite hide. The bandages on her hands had been soaked through since yesterday, and the chemical burns beneath them felt like they were on fire. "You're hurt too," Yuna observed with the simple clarity of children. "It's nothing, just. Let me see." Han Jamin's voice cut through the moment. He had been standing in the doorway, watching them with that unreadable expression he always wore, but now he crossed the room in 3 swift strides. "Mr. Han, I'm fine, really." He took her wrist before she could pull away, his grip firm but not rough, and began unwrapping the stained bandages. The fabric stuck to her raw skin, and Alara bit down hard on her lip to keep from making a sound. She would not show weakness in front of this man, would not give him a reason to think she could not do her job. But when the last layer fell away, revealing the angry red burns, the blistered skin, the cracks that had bled and scabbed and bled again, Jae-min went very still. His jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "How long?" His voice was low, controlled in a way that somehow made it more frightening. "It doesn't matter. I can still work, I can still take care of." "How long, Alara?" She swallowed. "Since I started here. The cleaning chemicals, they're strong, and I work long hours, and I couldn't afford proper gloves, so I just..." "Stop talking." He released her wrist and strode to the bathroom, returning moments later with a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in a surgical unit. Without a word, he sat on the chair beside Yuna's bed and gestured for Alara to give him her hands. "Sir, you don't need to. Give me your hands." She obeyed, too stunned to resist, and watched as Seoul's most feared crime lord carefully cleaned her wounds with antiseptic, his touch impossibly gentle. He worked with steady precision, applying antibiotic ointment to each burn, each crack in her skin, before wrapping fresh gauze around her fingers with the care one might use to handle something precious and breakable. Yuna watched them both, her small face thoughtful, and whispered, "Papa is being nice." "I can be nice," Jae-min said quietly, never looking away from his work on Alara's hands. "When someone deserves it." When he finished, he held Alara's bandaged hands between his own for a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing across the white gauze, and she felt something shift in the air between them, something that had nothing to do with employer and employee, and everything to do with the way broken people recognized each other's scars. The sound came from the garden, bright and unexpected as a bell ringing in an empty cathedral. Laughter. Not the polite, measured kind, but the wild, gasping laughter of a child who had forgotten she knew how. Alara had been chasing Yuna through the carefully manicured paths, pretending to be a clumsy monster who kept tripping over her own feet. It was a game her grandmother had played with her once, a lifetime ago, and watching Yuna run on legs that had barely held her weight 2 weeks ago felt like witnessing something sacred. The girl's pink dress fluttered behind her like butterfly wings, and when Alara finally caught her, spinning her around in a gentle circle, Yuna threw her head back and laughed until tears streamed down her cheeks. From the terrace above, Han Jae-min stood frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand. He had been negotiating a territorial dispute with a rival organization, the kind of conversation that usually demanded his full attention, but the sound of his daughter's laughter cut through everything else like light through darkness. He ended the call without explanation and simply listened, his chest tight with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Hope. That evening, when Alara tried to excuse herself to eat in the kitchen as she always did, Jaemin's voice stopped her at the dining room entrance. "Sit." She turned, confused, to find him gesturing to the chair beside his own at the long mahogany table. Yuna was already seated across from them, kicking her legs happily beneath her chair. "Sir, I don't think. You've taken care of my daughter for 2 weeks. You've brought her back from death. The least I can do is share a meal with you." His tone left no room for argument, but his eyes held something softer, something that looked almost like an invitation rather than a command. Alara sat, acutely aware of the house staff lingering in the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. In wealthy Korean households, the hierarchy was sacred, unbreakable. Maids did not eat with their employers. Especially not foreign maids. Especially not at the table of Han Jae-min. But Jae-min seemed entirely unconcerned with propriety. He served Yuna first, then, before Alara could reach for anything, he placed food on her plate with his own hands. Grilled fish, steamed vegetables, a portion of the rice she had taught him to cook the way Yuna preferred it, soft and easy to swallow. "You've been using your hands too much," he said quietly, noticing how she held her chopsticks awkwardly around the fresh bandages. "They need time to heal." Yuna watched them both with knowing eyes far too old for a 6-year-old. Papa looks at you different, she announced cheerfully, her mouth full of rice. Yuna, Jamin said, a warning in his voice, but the tips of his ears had turned red. He does, Yuna insisted. Like how he used to look at Mama. The words hung in the air between them. Ilara's chopsticks stilled halfway to her mouth, and she felt Jamin's gaze on her face, intense and searching. When she finally gathered the courage to meet his eyes, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude. Not just respect. Something deeper. Something dangerous. Something that felt like the beginning of falling. In the doorway, the head housekeeper whispered urgently to the chef, and within hours, every member of the household staff would know that the glass wall separating master from servant had not just cracked. It had shattered completely. The camera caught them at 3:15 in the afternoon. Ilara was teaching Yuna how to braid flowers into a crown, their heads bent close together in the private garden, sunlight filtering through the cherry blossoms above. Yuna's laughter carried on the breeze, clear and bright, the sound of a child who had remembered how to live. They had no way of knowing that across the street, hidden behind tinted windows in a black sedan, someone was watching. Someone who recognized the Han estate, who knew that the little girl in the pink dress should have been dead by now, who understood immediately that the dark-skinned woman beside her was the reason she was not. The photograph arrived 3 hours later, delivered in a white envelope with no return address. One of Jamin's guards brought it to him during a strategy meeting, and the moment he saw the image, his blood turned to ice. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were 5 words in Korean. The child has a weakness now. Below that, a symbol he knew too well. A white tiger, drawn in the same red ink, its mouth open in a silent roar. Jamin dismissed everyone from the room and stood at the window, the photograph crumpling in his fist. The White Tiger clan had been circling for months, waiting for an opening, waiting for him to show vulnerability. His daughter's illness had been a wound they could not exploit because a dying child drew sympathy, and even the underworld had certain lines it pretended not to cross. But a recovering child meant the game had changed. It meant there was something to take, someone to hurt, a way to bring Han Jamin to his knees. And now they had identified his greatest weakness. Not Yuna. Ilara. He found her in Yuna's room that evening, reading a storybook in her accented Korean while Yuna followed along, correcting her pronunciation with gentle patience. The scene was so domestic, so peaceful, that it physically hurt him to destroy it. Ilara. We need to talk. She looked up, and something in his expression made her smile fade. She kissed Yuna's forehead, promised to return, and followed him into the hallway. You're leaving tomorrow morning, he said without preamble. I've arranged for a car to take you to the airport. There's a ticket to London, enough money to start over, and a reference letter that will open any door you need opened. The color drained from her face. What? Why would I? Because staying here will get you killed. He thrust the photograph into her hands, watched her eyes widen as she understood what it meant. The White Tiger clan doesn't make empty threats. They've identified you as important to Yuna, which makes you a target. They'll use you to get to her, and they won't be gentle about it. Then increase security. Add more guards. I don't care, but I'm not abandoning that child. This isn't a discussion. You're right. It's not. Ilara stepped closer, her jaw set with a stubbornness that would have been admirable if it were not so terrifying. You promised me autonomy in caring for Yuna. You promised no interference. I'm not leaving her, Mr. Han. Not because of threats, not because you're afraid, not for any reason. I'm trying to save your life. And I'm trying to save hers. Her voice cracked slightly. She's just started healing. If I disappear without explanation, it will destroy her. You know it will. Jamin closed his eyes, torn between the instinct to protect this woman who had become impossibly precious to him and the knowledge that she was right. Yuna had lost her mother. Losing Ilara now might break what they had so carefully rebuilt. Then you stay close to me, he finally said, his voice rough. You don't leave the estate. You don't go anywhere without guards. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood. Elara nodded, but they both knew the truth. When the shadows came for them, running would not be enough. The decision to move Yuna to the safe house came at midnight. Jaemin had received word that the White Tiger clan was planning something, and he refused to wait around to discover what. 3 black SUVs idled in the circular driveway, engines purring, armed guards checking weapons with practiced efficiency. Elara carried a sleeping Yuna wrapped in a thick blanket, the child's face peaceful against her shoulder, unaware of the danger coiling around them like smoke. Jaemin held the car door open, his other hand resting on the gun beneath his jacket, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the estate gates. Middle vehicle, he instructed. Stay low, stay quiet. They were 15 minutes from the estate when the world exploded into chaos. The first impact came from the right, a truck ramming into the rear SUV with enough force to send it spinning off the road. The second came from ahead, another vehicle blocking their path, and suddenly they were boxed in, trapped on a stretch of empty highway with nowhere to run. Get down! Jaemin shouted, reaching for Elara, but she was already moving, already pulling Yuna beneath her as the first bullets shattered the windows. The driver jerked the wheel hard, trying to break through the blockade, but another impact sent them careening sideways. Time seemed to slow as the SUV left the ground, tipping, rolling, the world spinning in a nightmare of screaming metal and breaking glass. Elara's only thought was the child beneath her, and she curled her body tighter, making herself a shield, feeling the sharp bite of glass driving into her back, her shoulders, her arms. The vehicle hit the ground on its side, and everything went silent except for the ringing in Elara's ears and the frantic pounding of her own heart. Yuna, she gasped, tasting blood. Yuna, baby, are you hurt? Beneath her, the child was crying but breathing, terrified but whole. Elara tried to move and felt fire shoot through her spine, felt something warm and wet spreading across her back. Around them, gunfire erupted, Jaemin's guards engaging with the attackers, and through the cracked windshield she could see figures approaching, men in dark clothes with White Tiger patches on their shoulders. Jaemin was pulling himself through the shattered window, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his gun already raised. Elara, get her out. Go. But Elara's legs would not obey. The impact had done something, broken something, and when she tried to crawl toward the other door, dragging Yuna with her, her vision swam and her arms gave out. She collapsed onto the child, using the last of her strength to keep Yuna covered, to keep her safe, even as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. I've got you, she whispered to Yuna, though she was not sure if the words made it past her lips. I've got you, sweetheart. I won't let them take you. Yuna's small hands clutched at her, and the last thing Elara heard before consciousness slipped away was the child's terrified voice screaming for her father, and the sound of Jaemin roaring her name into the night like a man watching his entire world collapse. Pain dragged Elara back to consciousness. Blinding, white-hot pain that radiated from her back through every nerve in her body. She was moving, stumbling, and it took her several seconds to realize that Yuna was pulling at her arm, crying, begging her to wake up. Elara, please, they're coming, please get up. The gunfire had stopped. That was the first thing Elara registered through the fog of agony. The second was that she and Yuna were no longer by the crashed vehicle. Someone, she could not remember who, had pulled them into the darkness, away from the road, and now they were alone in what looked like an abandoned industrial area. Rusted warehouses loomed around them like the ribcage of some long-dead beast. Elara forced herself upright, biting down on a scream as glass shifted beneath her skin. Blood soaked through her shirt, but Yuna was unhurt, still whole, and that was all that mattered. She could hear voices in the distance, men calling to each other in Korean, searching. We have to hide, Elara whispered, taking Yuna's hand. Stay quiet, baby. Can you do that for me? Yuna nodded, tears streaming down her face, and together they limped toward the nearest warehouse. The door hung off its hinges, and inside, the darkness was absolute. Elara pulled Yuna behind a stack of rotting shipping crates, pressing the child against the wall and covering her with her own body once more. Footsteps echoed outside. Flashlight beams swept through the broken windows, slicing through the darkness like knives. Find them, a voice commanded. The boss wants the kid alive. The woman doesn't matter. Elara's hand found a piece of broken metal on the floor, a jagged length of pipe that felt solid and heavy. She was no fighter, had never thrown a punch in her life, but she would die before she let these men touch Yuna. Her vision swam, her hands shook, but she gripped that pipe like it was the only thing tethering her to consciousness. The door creaked open. A beam of light swept across the floor, moving closer to their hiding spot. Elara held her breath, held Yuna tighter, and waited. The man rounded the crates, his gun raised, and in that split second before he could shout for the others, Elara swung the pipe with every ounce of strength she had left. It connected with his knee with a sickening crack, and he went down hard, his weapon clattering across the concrete. She was on him before he could recover, pressing the pipe against his throat, her voice a snarl she did not recognize as her own. "How many of you are there? How many?" He spat blood at her, tried to reach for a knife at his belt, and Elara pressed harder until he choked out an answer. 6. 6 of us left. Where's Jamin? Where's her father? Dead, the man laughed wetly. Your boss is dead, and you're next. But then, cutting through the darkness like divine intervention, came the sound of gunfire. Precise, controlled, methodical. And beneath it, a voice Elara would have recognized anywhere, roaring commands with the fury of a man who had burned through hell itself to get here. Jamin. The warehouse door exploded inward, and he stood silhouetted against the night, his suit torn and blood-soaked, his gun smoking in his hand. His eyes found Elara and Yuna in the shadows, and something in his expression cracked open. Nobody touches them, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Nobody breathes near them. Or I will show you what real hell looks like. And then Han Jamin, the man they called the Ice King, unleashed his wrath on everyone who had dared to threaten his family. The steady beep of monitors was the first thing Elara heard, followed by the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. Her back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and when she tried to move, she found her hand caught in something warm. Someone was holding it. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the soft morning light filtering through the window, and found Han Jamin sitting in the chair beside her bed. His black suit had been replaced with a simple white shirt, wrinkled and blood-stained. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and stubble covered his usually immaculate jaw. He looked like he had not slept in days, like he had been sitting in that exact position, holding her hand, waiting for her to wake. "You're awake," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Yuna," Elara managed, her throat raw. "Is she? She's safe. Not a scratch on her because of you." His grip on her hand tightened, almost painful. "The doctors had to remove 37 pieces of glass from your back. You have 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, and you lost enough blood that they weren't sure you would make it through the first night. But I did. But you did." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her bandaged knuckles that felt like both a prayer and a confession. "You did, and I have spent every second since wondering what I would have done if you hadn't. If I had lost you the same way I lost her." Elara's breath caught. "Jamin, I'm in love with you." The words tumbled out of him like he had been holding them back too long, like they had been burning inside his chest. "I don't know when it started. Maybe when I first saw you holding Yuna's hand. Maybe when you refused to leave despite the threats. Maybe it was always inevitable from the moment you walked into my home. But I love you, Elara. And the thought of losing you terrifies me more than anything in this world." Before she could respond, the door burst open and Yuna came running in, her pink dress flying behind her, Jaemin's mother close behind trying to catch her. The child launched herself carefully onto the bed, mindful of Alara's injuries, and buried her face against her shoulder. Yama, Yuna sobbed, using the Korean word for mother. Yama, you came back. You came back like you promised. Alara's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Jaemin over Yuna's head, saw the question in his gaze, the hope and fear and love all tangled together, and she nodded. I came back, sweetheart. I'll always come back to you. To us, Jaemin corrected softly. Come back to us. 3 weeks later, when they finally returned to the Han estate, everything had changed. The guards still stood at the gates, the marble floors still gleamed, but the coldness was gone. Yuna's laughter echoed through the hallways. Alara's worn suitcase sat unpacked in the master suite, her clothes hanging beside Jaemin's expensive suits. And when they sat down to dinner that first night, there was no hierarchy, no separation, no invisible walls. Just a father who had learned that strength came in many forms, a daughter who had found her way back to life, and a woman who had crossed oceans and survived hell to become the heart of a family she never expected to have. Jaemin reached across the table and took Alara's hand, his thumb brushing across her healing scars, and smiled. Not the cold, controlled smile of a crime boss, but the genuine, unguarded smile of a man who had finally found his way home. Did this story move you? If you felt every moment of Alara's journey, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who believes in love that breaks all boundaries. And listen, subscribe to this channel immediately. Don't just watch and leave. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this, stories that will shake your heart and remind you what real love looks like, are coming your way, and you don't want to miss a single one. Subscribe now. This family's story may be complete, but your journey with us is just beginning.